Welcome to the course on Dalit Poetry. We are talking about Dalit Poetry and Overview Part 2. I am Archit Nanda, Assistant Professor at Keshav Mahavidyalaya, University of Delhi. And today we will be looking at how the foundation of Dalit poetry in the first Dalit conference led to an outpouring of Dalit literature in Marathi, as well as its offshoots into various other languages. So let us begin today's conversation with the beginning of what is the most significant and the most important moment in Dalit literature, which was the Marathi Dalit literature. As Ambedkar's social and political movement had its root in Maharashtra, the first outburst of Dalit fiction came from Maharashtra and was written in Marathi. And this came during 1950s and 1960s, though Annabahu Sahte wrote even before that. The most prominent writers of this moment were Baburao Bagul, Namdeo Dasal and Arjun Dangle. They were among the first famous writers who wrote poems, short stories that represented the struggles and captured the spirit of Dalit literature. From 1978 to 1986, there was a shift in Dalit literature because it moved away from poetry and short story to autobiographies. Autobiographies emerged as the most important genre in Dalit literature because it allowed writers to pour out their personal experience and to create social document about Dalit life. In some ways, the problem with all the previous literature was that it either ignored or marginalized the Dalit. The Dalit life was not at the center of the narrative, whereas with these autobiographies, the writers narrated their own lives and brought the Dalit subjecthood, the Dalit identity, the Dalit individual into the center of discourse. We heard and through these autobiographies about various rituals that were part of Dalit communities, various traditions that were integral to their community, and also about so many other forms of oppression that they had to face during their early childhood. Daya Pawar's Baluta and Baby Kamble's Jina Amucha, or The Prison We Broke, were some of the most significant Dalit autobiographies. In these autobiographies, the writers recounted their childhood traumas, explained the intricacies of Dalit tradition and exposed the systematic discrimination faced by the Dalits. The autobiographies also created a sense of hope and optimism as these writers were able to emerge from their systematic oppression and build for themselves a new life of dignity. Let us look at all these points in some detail. First of all, explain the intricacies of Dalit tradition. One of the things that was common among the Dalit community but was frowned upon by the larger Hindu community was the eating of beef. Daya Pawar in his autobiography mentions how when cows died in the village, the skin of the cows was taken off by the Dalit community, by the members of the Dalit community, and a celebration used to be held where they used to eat that meat. So these are little instances that we do not even perceive, that we do not imagine of being part of Indian society, or at least get marginalized in narratives of Indian society that find prominence about Dalit in Dalit literature. The second was in a Hindi Dalit autobiography by Kaushalya Besantri, where she recounts how her mother got remarried after being widowed, and being a widow in Hindu society at that time was frowned upon, but in Dalit communities, remarriage of widows was a common phenomenon. So these little things allowed us to see deeply into the intricacies of the Dalit tradition and to understand their lives from inside out. So also what was recounted was the systematic discrimination faced by Dalits. Sometimes the discrimination was by a professor. There are so many stories recounted in these narratives where students from the Dalit community were not given the equal space in classrooms. Some of them were asked to sit outside the classrooms while they were attending their classes because the other students did not want them to sit together. Om Prakash Valmiki narrates in his autobiography of an incident where the teacher of a school forced him, compelled him, primarily because he was belonged to the Dalit community, to clean the entire school, so that for all the students. It was almost unimaginable for a teacher that, like the upper caste students, this person was also a student. In the minds of the teacher, to the perspective of the teacher, a person belonging to a Dalit community could only engage in certain kind of profession and tasks, and therefore the teacher assigned him the task of cleaning the entire school. It was this humiliation, this discrimination, this marginalization that finds its expression in all these Dalit autobiographies. But what distinguishes Dalit autobiographies, they are not just documents of misery or documents of despair. They are, to a great extent, documents of hope. Because all of these writers who ended up writing Dalit autobiographies emerged from their particular conditions, emerged from their particular surroundings to become prominent writers in their language, to become established literary figures. So it is also a transformation of an individual throughout the narrative that is captured by Dalit autobiographies. In short, it is the story of rags to riches. Now let's look at how Dalit literature spread from primarily Marathi to other parts of the country. Even though the Dalit literature was creating robust new ripples in regional languages, especially Marathi, it was largely absent from the national stage. And in some ways, the fundamental shift happened in 1992 with the publication of a book called Poisoned Bread, edited by Arjun Dangle. The book was instrumental in introducing this robust tradition of Dalit literature to a wider audience all across the country, so that it was read not just by Maharashtrians in Marathi, but by people from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and in southern India. And this book had poems, short stories, essays, and extracts from Dalit autobiographies that essentially captured the very core, the very essence of Dalit literature, or at least the essence of Marathi Dalit literature that had happened over 2.5 decades. It was the essence that got permeated into this one book. The introduction of the book was written by Arjun Dangle, who traced the lineage of Dalit literature to Ambedkar, analyzed the social context that gave birth to Dalit literature, and discussed the tension that governed the movement from within. So the introduction, the poems, the short stories, the autobiographies, and the extracts from the autobiographies and the essays contributed a new beginning for the literature, not only in Maharashtra but at a national stage. The question that afflicts us now is, what led to the emergence of Dalit poetry? Why was poetry chosen as a form of expression by Dalit writers? And how do we perceive and understand Dalit poetry? Now, to understand that, we need to understand that there has been a long tradition of writing on Dalits, but not by Dalits. And especially in the modern times, Premchand wrote about Dalit, Mulk Raj Anand wrote about Dalits. So the initial development of literature as well as theory in terms of senses and other kinds of writings, either written by Westerners or by Indians of Dalits, always made them the object of analysis. The initial development of literature, theory, politics pointed towards Dalits as the object of analysis. They had to be studied as a group. They were an empirical presence in the country's statistics, people who had to be provided with resources and reservation. The conversation was about the upliftment of Dalits, and to uplift means that one was always outside the group that needed to be uplifted. This is an important point to understand, that this idea of upliftment comes to a certain extent from an idea of entitlement, where you are in a position to uplift the others. Whereas the voices around were engaging in discourses about Dalits, there was no space to express the interiority of what a Dalit person experienced. That interiority was absent. How they felt, how they lived, what were their struggles, all of this was completely marginalized from that literature. That was a literature of observation, but in that literature, interiority was absent. And therefore, the Dalit poetry at least emerged as an expression of the interiority of a Dalit subjecthood. What did a person feel and experience as a Dalit was expressed in these poems. Their experience and emotions, their ideas and beliefs, their stories and rituals were absent from the public sphere. Therefore, the emergence of Dalit writing marked a moment of self-expression, and especially Dalit poetry marked a moment where the politics turned from an objective politics, the politics of an observer, to subjective politics, where they themselves talked about their lives rather than other people talking about their lives. And the best way to express the emotional mindset or the emotional intensity of an individual is through poetry, and the intensity of their emotions found expression in what came to be later known as Dalit poetry. As is noted by Susi Tharu and K. Satyanarayan in their introduction to No Alphabet in Sight, which is a collection of writings by Dalit writers from southern India, the idea of caste as an objective structure, as in caste system or empirical information such as census, was displaced, and caste emerged as a subjectively effective identity of a social group. Basically, caste turned from what other people looked at and said to what an individual experienced on its own, and that marked the beginning of Dalit poetry. So, in this movement, this subjectivity also changed the connotation of the word Dalit. Dalit was always seen as a object of, or at least as a word that was an instrument of oppression. It spoke about a community that was marginalized. But what Dalit critics and writers saw, they contested this tendency to treat caste only as an instrument of oppression. Untouchability, violence, dehumanization, all of these are forms of oppression, and they wanted to recreate it as a new identity of self-assertion and even of pride. So now the notion of oppression had to be turned and transformed into finding a voice for these groups in a way that they could express themselves, assert themselves, and in a way engage and live with a certain level of pride around them. So Dalit politics and literature revoked caste to reaffirm the solidarity of a community and build a cultural unity among them. So this is the emergence of Dalit poetry in our times. And now we will look at how Dalit poetry could not just happen by the emergence of a new subjectivity. It had to also look for a new language. Apart from self-expression, Dalit poetry created a scope for a certain class of people, for bringing a certain class of people into poetry who had hitherto been excluded from it. The language of poetry had to be twisted, reshaped, and broken in order to create space for these new individuals and their life struggles to find expression. So they were the most oppressed, the most marginalized, were often outside the realm of poetry. Poetry was about the beautiful, the aesthetic, the lovely, and people who had harrowing lives often rarely entered the sphere of poetic expression. And one thing that Dalit poetry did, it had to look for a new language that allowed these different identities to find space in poetry, because these were the identities that Dalit people lived with. The exemplary person in all of this was Namdeo Dasal. Namdeo Dasal was the most innovative of all Dalit poets, as he transformed the language of literary expression in Marathi. Namdeo Dasal's poetry collection, Golpitta. Golpitta is that's the name of the poetry collection, but it was also of a name of a neighborhood in Bombay's red light area. It was published in 1972, and it is firmly believed, locates itself in the topography of Bombay. Golpitta was a frontal attack on the sensibilities of middle class, upper caste readership and the idle notion of poetry itself. The language was bitter and scatological. It was all about the urban space occupied by prostitutes, pimps, pickpockets, beggars and petty criminals, street urchins and gangsters. The underbelly of Bombay boiling was what Dasal looked for in his poetry, and it was this intense boiling underbelly of Bombay that was what contributed to the lives of Dalits also. So Dalit poetry found expression for a new kind of identities that were often and always excluded and marginalized from conventional poetry. And in creating that space, they also transformed language. The language, ordinary language, could not accommodate those people. So language was to be twisted and turned so that it could, in some ways incorporate the experiences of people. We will see how language was transformed in later stages during the course. So the second thing that the Dalit poetry did was, it was a form of self-expression. It was a way of finding a new language for literature, but it was at the end finally a culmination, at the end a critique of the nation itself, a critique of India itself, a critique of our nation state, which had failed to address the problems that were faced by Dalits. So, in his 1975 collection of poems entitled The Stupid Old Man Moved Mountains, Namdev Dasal narrates the meaning of Indian democracy, a democracy that has failed a lot of people. And with this, we come to the poetry itself. At the end of this overview, I will be looking at this small quotation from a poem by Namdev Dasal and a long poem by Om Prakash Valmiki to give you a taste of what Dalit poetry actually embodied. And both these poems in some ways deal with a critique of the Indian national identity. And I quote now Namdev Dasal's poem: "In hunger's dark empire, where intestines lie empty, a ferocious python is moving through the intestines. We can't burst into tears. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Private property is banyan tree, everyone's equal before law. Eat, drink, be merry, go to hell. Ah, how amazing is this age of darkness." Now, what Namdev Dasal does in this poem is he juxtaposes the hunger of a man or the hunger of a community, their intestines that are empty, that have not found food for days, and that immense anger and immense fire, the fire of the belly, like a ferocious python, is moving around their intestines, searching for food which does not exist there. And it is this image of a hungry person which is contrasted with the principles that are governed and enshrined in speeches, in the constitution, in our national identity. The principles of liberty, of equality, fraternity, the principles of private property, the principle that everyone's equal before law. In some ways, these principles fade and become nonsensical, even depreciate into meaninglessness when they encounter the face and the intestines of a hungry man. And it is this juxtaposition that he does to comment on how all these principles, the equality before law, the existence of private property, the existence of liberty, equality and fraternity, have not been able to fill the stomachs of people in this country. And this juxtaposition is what underlines the contradiction, the paradox that is our country. And he states at the end, "Eat, drink, be merry, or go to hell." Ah, how amazing is this age of darkness. Here we like to celebrate democracy, we like to celebrate nationalism, we like to celebrate our own country, but it is also a country where people are going hungry at every moment. Now, from Namdev Dasal's quotation from Namdev Dasal's poem, we move to a Hindi poet, a Hindi Dalit poet named Om Prakash Valmiki. I will read out his poem in Hindi and then I will offer an English translation, and we will look at how it looks at the idea of the Dalit and also how it critiques the idea of the nation. So this is Om Prakash Valmiki and this poem is titled Kuan Thakur Ka. चुल्ला मिट्टी का, मिट्टी तालाब की, तालाब ठाकुर का। भूख रोटी की, रोटी बाजरे की, बाजरा खेत का, खेत ठाकुर का। बैल ठाकुर का, हल ठाकुर का, हल की मूठ पर हथेली अपनी, फसल ठाकुर की। कुआं ठाकुर का, पानी ठाकुर का, खेत खलियान ठाकुर के, गली मोहल्ले ठाकुर के, फिर अपना क्या, गांव, शहर, देश. I will look at Archit Guha's translation of this poem, and after that I will go into an analysis of it. Now, this is a quintessential Dalit poem because it questions the role that the nation plays, or at least fails to play, in providing sovereignty, in providing a life of dignity to people. So let's look at the poem in English, and then we will have a discussion of it. The stove is made out of wood. The mud is sourced from the lake. The lake belongs to the landlord. We have a hunger for bread. Bread is made out of pearl millet. Pearl millet grows in the fields. The field belongs to the landlord. The bull belongs to the landlord. The plough belongs to the landlord. The hands on the shaft of the plough are ours. The harvest belongs to the landlord. The well belongs to the landlord. The water belongs to the landlord. The crops in the fields belong to the landlord. The lanes and the run-throughs, these neighborhoods, belong to the landlord. Then what is ours? The village, the city, the nation. In some ways, this is a poem about absence. Not an absence of Dalit subjecthood, but an absence of Dalit ownership. Here, the only presence we find of the Dalit identity or the Dalit subjecthood is in the hands that plow the fields. But the hands that plow the fields and the hands that collect water from the lake, or the hands that eat millet, or the hands that go and gather water, or the hands that plant trees, all of those hands do not own any of those things. The well, the water, the bread, the millet, the crops, the land, the plow, everything, the animal, everything belongs to the landlord. In some ways, this is the disposition of people in our community, in our country, who are able to exercise who are able to exercise labor around them to create. Who are the people who create food? The people who are the landless laborers. Who are the people who ensure that everything in the society is working? Who are the people who create those roads? Who are the people who build those houses? From construction workers to landless laborers, these are people who create everything in our society but are dispossessed of the rights to own any of those things. Everything at the end of the day belongs to the landlord. And if everything belongs to the landlord, what is it that belongs to us, the writer asks at the end? And the answer is, the question is, does the village belong to us if everything is owned by the landlord? Does the city belong to us? Does the nation belong to us? In some ways, in a nation that has failed to provide even the basic necessary things to people, has failed to make them possess of their own livelihood, in surviving in that nation, the Dalit community lives completely dispossessed of any kind of dignified life, any kind of property, any kind of place that they could claim as home, because everything around them is owned by either the landlord, the city, the nation, the people from the upper caste. And this is this disposition that marks their identity. They are in this larger picture of dispossession, mainly hands who perform all the work, whereas the fruits of that labor, the fruits of that work are taken and kept by others who own the land. And it is this dispossession that is challenged. It is this dispossession that is critiqued. It is the nation that is implicated as the reason beyond behind this dispossession that marks the core, the intrinsic value of what Dalit poetry represents for us. With this, we are coming to an end of our session on Dalit poetry and overview. In this session, we looked at the first flourishing of Dalit literature after the initial Dalit conference in 1958 happened in Marathi language, as poems, short stories and autobiographies were written by Dalit writers, but all of them primarily in Marathi language. The first major collection of Dalit literature that brought Dalit literature to the national stage was Poison Bread, which was published in 1992 and was edited by Arjun Dangle. So it started in Maharashtra, and then through Poison Bread it moved to the entire nation. Now there are three features that I've spoken about Dalit poetry. Dalit poetry was a source of self-expression that offered a critique of the Indian nation state. While earlier Dalits were just looked up as an object of analysis in other people's work, now they were expressing their own lives and offering a critique of the Indian nation state. In order to do so, Dalit poetry had to explore new idioms of expression in language, in style, in metaphors, while giving space to individuals who had been ostracized from poetic realms, like we find in the poetry of Namdev Dasal. We finally looked at a poem by Om Prakash Valmiki that expresses the major concerns of Dalit poetry, and with this we come to the conclusion of this session. In the next session, we will be talking about how Dalit poetry and politics spread across the country, but it manifested differently in different states. And in the next lecture, we will look at how Dalit politics was shaped in Kerala while analyzing the poetry of a major Dalit Malayalam writer, Sunny Kavikar. So, see you for the next session.